Alrighty. Okay, so hello everyone. My name's Pranjan. I'll introduce myself in a bit, but this is being recorded, so if you want to watch it again in the future, or send it to some of your friends or anything like that, that's always an option. So essentially the session, I'm going to first start by going over some tips and advice, about the MMI. I'll start first by explaining what the MMI is, which I'm sure most of you already know. So I'll go through that pretty quickly, but I'll get into some of the tips and tricks. I have some questions that I've heard and been asked a lot that I'm happy to answer. And then, the rest is just a Q&A for you guys to see what's going to help you the most. So with that, the seminar is being recorded. I am a consultant at Accepted Together. I used to be a consultant at their previous company, Future Me MD, as well. So I have a lot of years of experience kind of teaching students and through the whole medical school process. Just a bit more about me. Right now I'm in my second year at McMaster. I just started clerkship actually, so I'm in my emergency medicine rotation. Just came back from a shift a few minutes ago, so I might be a bit frazzled, but I'm excited and happy to be here. I got into McMaster after completing my bachelor's degree at Western in MedSci. I did have an interview after my third year at Mac, but that was the COVID year. And not sure if you guys know, but Mac decided to do like this weird formula where they had half the people get in based on your pre-admission score, and the other half they did a lottery, and I didn't get in off the lottery. So as a whole thing, but I did get in after my fourth year at MedSci at Western. I also was accepted to Queens as well, and I chose McMaster over Queens. And this is kind of uh, how I would picture my application. There's just three main things I think, especially at Mac and for a lot of medical schools, right? It's your GPA, your MCAT, and it's CARS, especially that gets in the way for a lot of people. Casper, and then you have some schools require essays and things like that. But for me, my GPA was below the average accepted, so that was low. My overall MCAT and CARS was high, and then of course I did well on Casper. And so it kind of everything balanced out. And I think that's what really made my application successful. I did have a lot of other things I did during undergrad. I did a lot of advocacy and policy work, writing policy papers. I was very research heavy in my application as well. So different things like that can make up for certain aspects of your application. So, if you're not that perfect applicant, like don't be scared, don't worry. No one is. And then things do work out at the end. Outside of medicine, I love playing sports. I grew up playing hockey and volleyball with my friends. I'm a bit of a nerd. Play a lot of chess. I try to when I can. I'm not that good, but hopefully we'll get there. And then I love teaching. Like I love offering these sessions. I usually do a couple of free sessions a year. I'm doing one next Friday as well. So, if you have any friends that couldn't make it today, I encourage them to come out next Friday. And so that's a big passion of mine. And of course, like I said, I'm a consultant now at Accepted Together as well. So that's just a bit of a background about me. And let's get into really like, some of the basics, like what is the MMI? So the MMI, or, multi-mini interviews, essentially most of your schools that you're interviewing at for the MMI will be between 6 to 10 stations. And it really consists of these things, right? They're looking for your teamwork, communication, and then I'm not going to read the list. You can go ahead and read that. But the advantage of the MMI is that it's your opportunity to make 6 to 10 brand new impressions on 6 to 10 different people. And then that's pretty powerful, because sometimes if you just have a traditional interview where you go in and you sit in front of a panel, and let's say they don't immediately like you, or there's something that they're off-putted by, right? That impression is going to stick throughout, and it's going to affect the way that you get graded. However, on the MMI, you get these different opportunities to showcase and highlight your strengths and your weaknesses, and talk about a plethora of different questions to really give them a broad and a holistic understanding of who you are and how you think. And that's the advantage. It's good for applicants, and it's good for medical schools as well, when they or whatever professional school you're applying to, when they look at your or when they grade your MMI. So there's a few things about the MMI that we can talk about. So like I said before, it's 6 to 10 stations usually, and in that you usually have 10 minutes for the MMI. At most schools, you'll have 2 minutes, to prepare, and then you get 8 minutes to kind of answer your questions. Now, these questions can be varied. There can be, character development questions asking you about your personal victories and battles and challenges that you've had to go through. They can ask you about policy questions, where you have to make a policy recommendation or a final choice at the end regarding, these macro level issues at a more systemic or governmental level. There are there's situational aptitude questions where you might have some role playing you have to do, or some teamwork and different things like that. And the entire idea is for them to see your thought process, right? For them to understand how you think and why you think that way. And in 8 minutes is a lot of time for you to really be able to get in depth and analyze topics from different perspectives, and provide creative solutions throughout your answer. And so that's kind of a way for them to get that thought process. I'm seeing on this chart here, there's also ethical scenarios, which is exactly right as well. Sometimes you have to choose between two difficult choices. Yeah, for example, a classic question is, do you give a liver, you only have one liver transplant you can do. Do you give it to the 19-year-old kid that has his whole life ahead of him, but is an alcoholic and keeps coming to the emergency department? Or do you give it to an 80-year-old professor that, spent their entire life teaching students and is a pillar of the community, but they're 80 and they have a lot of other comorbidities and they're probably going to die soon? What do you do there? How do you decide? So questions like that are very relevant on the MMI. And of course, there are break stations as well as you kind of go throughout it. Depending on if there's 10 stations, for example, McMaster has 10 stations, 8 are actual questions, and then 2 are break stations where you just take that time to decompress, take some time off. There'll be students there that you can talk to that are currently in their med school, and you can ask them questions if you need, or you can just sit in complete silence, whatever works for you. And finally, although most schools are trying to do synchronous MMIs, there might be some schools that still do asynchronous. And that means, it's just you talking to a blank screen and your answer is being recorded and it'll be marked at a later date. Or if it's synchronous, you have someone in front of you that's interacting with you and you can feed off that energy. And it is easier that way, but their actions or their comments might throw you off. And that might be something that you have to get used to and really ensure that you're prepared for that, to have those human interactions with someone else if it's a synchronous interview. So we'll get into, there's 13 med schools in Canada that require the MMI, depending on wherever you're applying. You have Alberta and Calgary, British Columbia, Manitoba, Memorial, Dal. In Ontario, you have McMaster, Awesome, and Queens. And in Quebec, you have McGill, Montreal, and Sherbrooke. And then, of course, Saskatchewan, in the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatchewan. Okay. So this is MMI scoring sheet. This is specific to McMaster. You can find this online. So this isn't some private information that I'm telling you guys, but it's a good way to kind of go into it and see how people are being marked. Right. This is specific to McMaster, so that's the caveat. But it's you can assume that other schools are very similar. And as you can see, right, it says you're rating the applicant's overall performance on the station relative to the pool of all the other applicants you're rating. So that means that you're really being judged against the people in your same circuit, right? So if you have 10 stations, you have 10 people in your circuit, and they're judging you against those people that they see in that circuit. And especially at McMaster, you're being considered on only 3 things, right? Communication skills, that comes down to how well you present yourself, what you say, how you say it, how you're dressed, your pronunciation, your making sure you have good pauses, not saying a lot of ums and ands, nonverbal communication skills. All of that kind of come into communication skills. Then you have the strength of the arguments expressed, and that's really about what you're saying and how well you're able to support your points. Are you considering it from a variety of perspectives? Um, uh, um, yeah, it's basically the content of your answer. And then this last thing is kind of, it's hard to judge, but applicant suitability for the medical profession. So that's kind of that subjective aspect of it as well. Excuse me, the subjective aspect of it as well, where depending on how you've carried yourself throughout the interview and things like that, they can judge your suitability for the profession. And you can see 5 is satisfactory. So that means that's the average that people are going to get. 7's above average, 10's outstanding. And then of course you have the lower end, 1 and 3 at unsuitable and less suitable. So it kind of just wraps your head around what they're looking for and how you're being evaluated. So I thought I would throw that in there. If you have any questions, just send them in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself. If you want, I'm more than happy for you guys to turn your cameras on. So I'm not just talking to blank screens, but no pressure there, whatever works for you guys. Okay, so let's get into kind of some of these tips and tricks for the MMI, right? There's 2 aspects like we discussed before, yeah? So you have communication skills, which is kind of how you say things, and then the strength of the arguments expressed, which is what you say. And so both of those are very relevant to it. So what do they kind of include? And I think it's important to go into it knowing that, right? So I personally believe there's 2 components to a strong MMI answer. And then how you say it is your introduction, your road mapping, and your formatting. So in your introduction, some schools, and you can ask, once you get interviews and things like that, you can ask the schools, should I introduce myself? Like, am I allowed to say my name or not? And some schools say, no, don't say your name at all. And some schools are like, yeah, of course, you're more than welcome to introduce yourself. And even for those schools that say, don't say your name, you can still have an introduction that just doesn't include your name. For example, something that I always encourage people to say is, recognize this is a weird format. Although we've been in COVID, for 3 years now, and we're used to virtual, this still isn't the traditional way med school interviews are done online, or even if it's asynchronously, right? That's really out there. And so it's you say, hi, I'm excited to be here, and you say, I understand this is a weird way to have an interview, but I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my answer. Things like that. It helps build rapport. It shows you're human. You understand that there's something, that this isn't kind of the norm, and you're able to adapt to that and move on. So having that introduction is not only key for rapport, but also you've just spent 2 minutes, right, really thinking hard and thinking of ways of answers you're going to give and ways you're going to analyze the situation. And having the set introduction that you do over and over gives you an extra 10, 15, 20 seconds to just calm your mind, right? Get into the rhythm and then really get into your answer. And so I think having an introduction is really important. Similar with road mapping. If you think back to any of your lectures you've had in undergrad, or anytime you've seen a really powerful speaker present, at the beginning of their anecdote or their lecture or speech or whatever they're doing, they'll usually roadmap to make sure that the listeners understand where they're going to go. And that's very important on the MMI as well, right? You want to tell your interviewer how you're going to answer this question. Lay out some big picture topics and points that you're going to hit so that it primes them to listen for those things. And you also have the primacy effect working in your favor here, where it's an 8-minute interview, it's online, people might get distracted and they might stop paying attention. But if you've roadmapped at the beginning, then at least, let's say they forget to listen, right? Or they get distracted. When they're marking you, they'll know, okay, this applicant told me they were going to talk about this. I'm going to assume they talked about it, and I'll give them those marks that they deserve. And so road mapping is really important as well. And then you have formatting, and that's kind of how you structure your answer. Structure on the MMI is incredibly important. It keeps you organized, but it also helps whoever's listening to your answer be organized, and that answer comes across as a rehearsed speech, as one as one answer that you're giving together, instead of having all of these fragments and ideas all over the place. And so formatting is going to be really important. I have some formats that I used personally for my interview, but I think a really good one that you can find this online too, and it works for a lot of scenarios, is just to divide up your answer based on perspectives. right? If you're directly involved in the situation, your perspective, or the perspective of your patient, or the perspective of the government or company, or the perspective of the parents or your community members, whoever it is, right? You divide, you make sure you're going to tell them these points based on these perspectives. And that's a solid way to do it. If you do choose to, get some lessons with me, I have other formatting methods I think that work really well, and I'm happy to share those. But the perspectives is something that's going to work for everyone and work in most scenarios. And then the second aspect is kind of the what you say. So these are your personal anecdotes, your personal examples that you're throwing in there, the stories that you have, the lessons that you've learned over your life, right? What makes you you essentially. And that's important. That's something that if it fits in the answer, put it in there. Sometimes people try to have, a personal example for every MMI question, and that's just unrealistic. That's not how the MMI works. Answer the question first, right? And then throw in your personal examples. But when possible, put it in there, and that gives you marks. Or your knowledge and your content, right? Knowing some of the legal materials, knowing, dates and people's names and policies that actually occur in the real world, having background knowledge in how the healthcare system works. Are we a public healthcare system? Are we a private healthcare system? Is there a mixture in between, right? Different things like that. Those are all things that come across as you being well prepared and well read. And then the last is what I like to call the subtle flex category. It's a sentence you throw here and there to impress someone, if you're talking about some policy, you can say, oh, back in undergrad when I was writing policies at McMaster, right? And then I learned this, and then you move on and you start answering the question, and you can use what you learn and apply it to your answer. But that's kind of like a subtle flex. It's kind of showing off your CV or your resume and whatnot. And if it fits, toss it in there, but don't force it in, right? For the most important thing is that knowledge or that content, and actually making sure you're answering the question that's being asked for you or to you. Okay. So tip number 2, practice, practice, practice. This is the MMI is a beast. It's a massive thing to prepare for. It's not easy, and if you take it lightly, like other people applying will be working, a couple hours a day, every day until their interview date. And I encourage you to do the same. And I think I have a good way to kind of show the importance of practicing. So I have a little question here, right? And I want you guys to take some time to think about it. And then I want you to unmute yourself and tell me what you would do here, or what you think, right? So the question essentially is, 14-year-old patient requests some birth control pills from you as her physician, but also asks you that you don't tell her parents. So what do you do here? What are the points to consider? Here, I'll type them out. There are no wrong answers. Whatever comes to mind, it's all valid. Okay, so someone said in the chat, see if the individual is fit to make their own decisions. Yeah, fantastic. So that's something that'll be important. What else? Are you all thinking, or is everyone just shy and nervous? I'll give it a minute. Great. Someone said patient confidentiality. Well, that's important. Perfect. Okay, we're getting some more answers. Ask why the patient doesn't want to tell the parents, or can you help mediate this conversation? Very nice. Someone again, kind of in the similar line, said, ask why do they want it? Someone said, empathize with the patient's concern by telling her that you understand her wish to keep this information private. Perfect. Making sure that she understands the responsibility and the consequences. Good, very good. Okay. All right. So this is good, right? This is a good starting list. If you have any more answers, feel free to send them or unmute yourself and tell me what they are. But let's take a look at this list so far. So see if the individual is fit to make their own decisions. That's good. That's known as capacity, right? But can you as a family physician evaluate capacity? Or the primary care physician here evaluate capacity? Or does it have to be done by a psychiatrist? Does anyone know the answer to that? Okay. Someone said, I think you can do it as a primary care physician. That's right. That's right. I was just trying to, as a trick question. So you can, right? Any physician can evaluate capacity. But it's important to know that because you might be challenged on that, or it's something that you have to say, right? Sometimes people wrongly assume that, oh, I'm not trained in this. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't know what's going on in their head. But no, everyone can evaluate capacity. And what's the definition of capacity? Right? You should know that definition of capacity and say that. And it's something along the lines of being able to understand and appreciate the consequences of your decisions, and the healthcare outcomes, or something along those lines. And so that's the definition, right? Patient confidentiality. So someone said that. That's fantastic. So what does that mean? Can you elaborate on that? Am I allowed to tell her parents if they come in, they find, let's say, prescriber the pills, they come in and they find the pills and they say, what are you doing? It's my 14-year-old daughter. She's underage. How can you do this without telling me? Do I tell them? Or in the first place, before I prescribe it to them, do I have to tell them before I prescribe it because she's a minor? What does everyone think? Okay. Yeah. So yeah, so there are a few people that say, oh, she's under 16, so you need to tell the parents. And you know what? That's a good thought. And that's kind of the obvious answer that you come to, based on, how we know about the law, and you have to be 18 to or 19 to drink, and 18 to be an adult and vote, and all of these things. But in healthcare, there is no minimum age you need to be able to get in Ontario to be able to give consent to your own healthcare decisions, as long as you have capacity. That's the only requirement, right? There is no minimum age. So you see how it's important to know what these concepts are and what the law is in Ontario and Canada for healthcare, because it makes a big difference in your answer. And if you said, oh no, like I would tell her, oh, I'm so sorry, I understand where you're coming from, but I have to tell your parents I can't prescribe these to you. Well, that would be the wrong answer on the MMI, unfortunately. So again, doing your research, knowing these laws and practicing is important. Someone said it's important to establish trust with your patient, which is where confidentiality comes into play. Exactly, right? It's the patient-physician relationship. But when do you have to report? When do you have to break confidentiality? Are there ever any circumstances where you're allowed to break confidentiality? Does anyone know that? And while you think of that, someone asked, where can we find these guidelines and laws? I have that included in my presentation, and I'll talk more about it at a little bit later on. Good. So someone said you might have a responsibility to report when they're at high risk of harming themselves or others. That's correct, right? That's one way. Or for minors, you have to tell them, report or break confidentiality when there's abuse going on, right? Whether that means one parent's abusing the child and you tell the other parent, whether that means to make a complaint to the what is it? Child Protection Agency, CPA, or Child Authorities and Protection Agency, CAPSA, or something like that, right? So know your laws. When can you break confidentiality? When are you legally obligated to? Or when do you have a professional or fiduciary responsibility to break a confidentiality? You always have to report STIs, right, and sexually transmitted disease, because that's a public matter of public health, and you have to report those to the government. Different things like that. It's important to know. And again, comes with practice, that comes with doing questions, that comes with reading, right? Someone said, why do they want it? Yeah, that's a good question. So what are possible reasons that someone might want to be on birth control? Good. So someone said they're taking part they're taking part in or considering taking part in sexual activity. They're sexually active. There's other responses: cramps, practice safe sex, acne treatment. Exactly. So those are there's more than one reason, right? Instead of jumping directly to, oh, they might be considering, or they are already sexually active. Sometimes you have women have strong menstrual cycles with a lot of flow, and birth control can help control that, or have regular cycles. That's one way. Hormonal acne can be treated using birth control. That's another reason someone might be into it. But if you think about it, there's other reasons as well, right? What about social pressure? She's 14. She's in high school in grade 9, just started high school, maybe all of her friends are on birth control, right? It's the cool thing to do. That's always a consideration, especially in kids and teenagers. So you have to think more creatively and more broad outside of what the question's asking for, and consider these other factors that might be affecting it. And finally, empathize with the patient's concern. We talked a bit about that, when you have to keep it private. We talked about capacity, which is 0.6 as well. So those are good considerations, right? But now I'm just going to add a couple more. So we talked about it quite at length from this legal perspective, or this idea of, gathering more information. So you should do this in a private area and where she doesn't feel rushed. You ask her why she's interested in birth control. You find out what she knows about birth control, and if she's used birth control in the past or other forms of contraception. You ask if she has any other medical issues that might be a contraindication to birth control, right? You sensitively ask if she is sexually active, or if she's being forced or coerced into something. These are all important considerations. So that's just one aspect of gathering more information. Then you have this idea of patient-centered care versus paternalism. And what does that mean, right? What is paternalistic medicine versus patient-centered care medicine? And this importance of health in there, right? So you have to make sure that she understands the risks and benefits. You have to see if prescribing that birth control would outweigh those risks and benefits. Her safety is important, and it's important to address her if she is using it for, if she's sexually active, that this doesn't prevent STIs, right? And so you still have to give appropriate recommendations for that. Then you have your legal aspect that we talked a bit about. What's the minimum age to have to consent to make your own health decisions? What are your reporting obligations to Children's Aid and Child Protection? What do you do if the parents find the pills and confront you? Do you tell them what happened? Are you allowed to? When or when not? Right? Then you have your social aspects. Maybe she can't tell her parents because of their cultural barriers in the way. What might those cultural barriers be, and how can you help navigate them, right? It's maybe you aren't the foremost expert here. Maybe you should ask for help from other healthcare professionals that can help get this conversation going, and maybe involve healthcare professionals, the 14-year-old asking for birth control, and their parents as well, and put that all together and get those conversations going. Other social considerations: how's she going to pay for them? It's not covered by OHIP fully, and so you still have to pay out of pocket. And people usually pay with the insurance, their parents' insurance or their own insurance. But if she doesn't want to tell her parents, how's she going to pay for them? Other consideration is birth control pills are only given in periods of 60 days or 90 days. So just to come back every 2 to 3 months to get a prescription renewed. Is she going to be able to take time off? How is she going to be able to come without her parents knowing? Right? These are all questions that are difficult to answer, and perhaps pushing towards the way of having this conversation with the parents if possible, right? And then follow-up. That's something that people miss, right? This isn't a problem that's going to be done in one conversation. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Put your hands away, right? It's going to be something that you're going to have to follow over time to see if we can solve all these social and cultural issues, if she's tolerating the birth control, if she's having side effects, if we want to change the type of contraception or change the company or the amount of hormones and progesterone and estrogen we're giving her. All of these things will require follow-up, continuous follow-up, and that's also important. So you can see how we all put our brains together and came up with a few points, but these are points that everyone's going to come up with, right? But it's only through practice and through reading and going over different scenarios and making sure that you're considering all of these different perspectives and thinking in a creative way that you come up with some of these other points that I listed. And that makes a really strong, holistic answer. It makes them understand that you've prepared and that you're ready to understand what might seem like an easy scenario and see all of these nuances and these gray zones, right? Something important to remember in medicine is that what's normal for you is not what's normal for everyone else. And that range of normalcy really varies. And so you have to be able to consider all of these different perspectives in there and include them in your answer. So the whole point of this exercise was to really hit home that point, right? Like practice, practice, practice. There's nothing more important than that. Let's say you have a 4.0 and you get a 3.9 on a midterm, but you've been practicing for your med school interview or your professional school interview. That's okay, because that's worth it. It's okay to do that, at least in my opinion. Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, and so this brings us to a question like, what should I learn? Like, what do I study? And please keep in mind, this is a very small list of things, but it's just stuff that comes up a lot. And when I say high yield, low yield, medium yield, this is from my personal anecdotal evidence, having talked to other students, having done my own interviews, talked with some of my friends about what I think is really important. So starting off right off the bat, I think indigenous ethics is a great topic to study. It's very likely to come up on the MMI, and it's very relevant to healthcare in Canada, right? And because of that, I say it's high yield. So in not just indigenous ethics, but knowing some of the history and the background about colonialism and about residential schools and the impact they've had on the social aspects of those that are indigenous. And then, of course, healthcare itself, right? Know the names and the stories of people who've been wronged by the Canadian healthcare system and are indigenous. People like Joyce Echuan or Brian Sinclair, who stayed in an emergency department for 26 hours and died in the waiting room, right? What went wrong there? Why did that happen? How can we solve it in the future, right? Know about some struggles that are ongoing. For example, I'm not exactly sure if it's high risk only or if it's all pregnancies, but definitely high risk, I think. If you live in the territories and you're giving birth to a high risk pregnancy, you have to fly down to Manitoba to give birth, right? And I think your flight is covered, but not your partners, not your families, right? You might be a 21-year-old woman, all scared, all alone in a random city that you've never been to, hours away from home, with random people around you doing one of the most difficult things you've ever done in your life. Like, there's so many factors that come into play here, right? And it's easy to see their impact on healthcare, but why is this in place, right? How can we solve it? Are there better solutions? Are other countries doing a better job? Things like that. It's super important to know, I think. Brain death, I think, is low yield because it's a very classic MMI question or an med school interview question, or professional school interview question, I think, about you have a patient that's brain dead, no brainstem reflexes for the last 6 months. They're just living on the respirator, but their family doesn't want to let them go. But they're in the ICU and costing the healthcare is $15,000 a day. What do you do? It's a very classic question. It's unlikely to come up because it's been done a lot, but it's important to know, right? What are different types of death, brain death versus cardiac death and things like that. Children and medical decisions, we already went through that, and I'll list some resources of how to find out more information. I think that's medium yield. Confidentiality, we talked a bit about that. Medium yield. Disclosure of medical error, I say, is low yield because, again, it's one of those classic questions. You make a mistake, what do you do? Well, the research is pretty clear. You admit your mistake, and that leads to better healthcare outcomes, less chance of you being sued, stuff like that. End of life care, I think, is a good topic. What is palliative care? What does it mean? You can even become philosophical here. What does it mean to live a good life, right? Why is it important to have end of care discussion? How are we mistreating the elderly in our healthcare system? Do we have ageism in our healthcare system? We have all these baby boomers that are going to be becoming old or already on their way, right? And that's going to increase our elderly population through the roof. So is our healthcare system able to take care of them or not? Different things like that. I think MAID, euthanasia assisted suicides, very high yield because it's so clinically relevant right now. If you don't know, we've just are debating changing the inclusion criteria for MAID to include those with their only healthcare problem being a mental illness, and they might qualify for MAID. And that's a very controversial thing going on right now. So look into that and see these mental health organizations. Are they pro or are they against this bill, and why or why not? Religious bioethics, I say, is low yield. Classic question again. You have a Jehovah's Witness that comes in, but they need a blood transfusion. They're unconscious. The blood transfusion is going to save their life, but they have a Jehovah's Witness card. What do you do? Classic question. So it's unlikely to come up, but good to look into. Reproductive technologies, I think, is important. Stuff like what's it called? IVF, in vitro fertilization, CRISPR-Cas9, test tube babies, different things like that. And then truth telling, again, kind of goes back to the idea of disclosure of medical error. It's a classic question, but it's good to know, and that's how I'd rank it more low yield. But this is just a small list of 10 among many, many other topics that you want to read about and practice and do scenarios related to. Okay, so moving on. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt, send a message on the chat, whatever. Okay, so this brings me to tip 3, the right words and the not so right words. So when you're giving this talk and this presentation, of course, you want to speak like an expert, but that means using your words carefully and correctly. And so I've created a list of some words that I think you should know the meaning of and use them appropriately. They're very likely to come up in your answers. And it's good to use the correct vocabulary here. So things like health literacy, the therapeutic relationship between a physician and patients. Well, we talked about this a bit before. What is medical paternalism? Do you have a fiduciary responsibility to your patients? Things like the wealth gap and how that affects the access gap. Informed consent is a big one, right? How do you ensure that you have informed consent? Capacity, we talked a bit about. Cultural competent care, what does that mean? I think even that terminology has changed now, and there's a more appropriate statement for it. I can't remember off the top of my head, but look into that. Talked a bit about palliative care. What does it mean to live a good life? Having DNR, or knowing your code status, having these difficult conversations, things like that. And of course, evidence-based medicine. That's what we talk about all the time. EBM, evidence-based medicine, right? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? Can you have evidence-based medicine and be culturally competent at the same time? How do you go about doing that? Stuff like that. So those are good words to know and use. And then you have, these are your classic 4 pillars of ethics in medicine: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and equity. And I feel like it's a bit overdone, right? Instead of saying beneficence, the idea is basically do good, right? Non-maleficence is do no harm, right? Those are easier words to understand and digest, and it comes across more natural when you say it in that sense. So I'm not saying don't use them. I've used autonomy before. It's super important, but be careful and don't overuse these words that, have become cliches or things that everyone's going to talk about and include in their answers, I think. Okay, sorry, I'm going through it a bit quick. If you need me to repeat stuff or slow down, just let me know. I just want to make sure we get through everything. Okay, and so this brings us to tip 4, use the correct resources. It doesn't matter how many resources you have. If you don't know how to use them, it'll never be enough. And so I'm not going to give you a massive list. I'm just going to give you a few, and use them wisely and carefully, and they'll really help. And for all of these MMI questions, just a quick Google search online is more than likely to yield a lot of results for questions. So I'm not really going to get into that, but in terms of resources, I'm sure everyone's seen, this WashU ethics website when they're prepping for Casper or studying or doing right is something it's a book that's recommended a lot. Instead of all of that, take down this website. This is the CPSO, so the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. It's a list of all of their policies. And so it goes into everything we talked about, right? It even goes into, let's say you're closing a practice. What are your legal obligations there? You're going on vacation. What are your obligations there? When do you have to report? What are your obligations for confidentiality, children and medical decisions? Every policy that governs physicians in Ontario is listed on there. So read them. You don't have to take notes. You don't have to memorize them. Just have them in your head somewhere. And when you get a question related to it, of course, you can refer back to try and re-jog that memory and really cement it. But that's a fantastic website to use. And then there are other resources. So British Columbia released this paper. It's called In Plain Sight Summary. It's a report about Indigenous healthcare specific to BC, but I'm sure it can be applied to other provinces. And I encourage you to read that as a starting point. Then you have your social side of medicine. This is a podcast that you can listen to when you're driving, when you're cooking, when you're working out, when you're walking to class. It's called White Coat, Black Art. It's by a Canadian physician. It's on CBC. You can find it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all that jazz. It's fantastic. They do a great job of going into some of these social aspects of medicine and doing a deep dive and talking to experts in Canada and really coming up with a nice story. And the kid's going to keep you informed about relevant things going on. And then Healthy Debate, it's another great website. It's Canadian. It talks about some of these controversial topics in healthcare. People can post their own opinions and their own articles and different responses and things like that. A really good way to get a nuanced idea about these topics that are high yield and coming up a lot recently. So I think it's a good list to start at. And of course, as you get better, you'll make your own list and you'll find more resources that work for you as well. Right. And then this is the last tip I have. So find a good group of prep partners. Now, honestly, I didn't fully believe this when I was prepping, and I'll tell you a bit of my personal story. So I prepped almost every day from when I got my interview, when I found out I had an interview till my MMI, with a group of about 3 to 4 people. And, sometimes people are busy, sometimes the group's smaller, sometimes it's bigger. But at the back of everyone's mind, and I'll be honest, even in my mind as well, it was like this idea that, oh man, like I'm practicing with these people. I'm giving them really good advice. They're giving me good advice. We're working together. But what if they get in and I don't, right? What if they steal all my idea? And it's like this invasive thought that you have. Of course, it's not good, but it's something that people have, and that's okay. And then the day of the results came out in May, and we're all waiting at midnight, and we all check, and I'm like, oh, I got in, and everyone in that group chat was like, I got it, I got it, I got it. And I was like, oh my God, there's a glitch in the system. There's no way all of us got in. There must be something wrong. Maybe they just sent acceptances to everyone by accident. And then you go on Reddit and Pre-Med 101, and you see, people got some rejections as well, and you're like, whoa, like this is real. And in that moment, I realized that it's not me against 449 other applicants, right? That's having that mindset is going to be really hard to be able to perfect your strategy and find people you work with. It's actually us 3 or us 4 against the 445 or the 446 other applicants. And if we're all honest with each other and we give good feedback and we work hard and we're collaborative and we're not trying to hide things or do be shady, then all of us will get in. And now you have this great group of friends starting medical school, or whatever you're applying to, and it works really well. And I think this picture really helps show that, right? Like you can hit the arrow on the bull's eye with help from your friends. And so I highly recommend you try and find a good group of people to prep with and prep regularly with, and be open and honest with each other in your feedback and constructive criticism. So that brings me to the end of my topic. I'm just gonna put out some of the packages I offer. Of course, we can work around this as well, depending on the number of hours and how you want to do it. I offer MMI prep, MPI prep, panel or traditional interview. All of them, include my personal formats I use, my other strategies, notes, interview bank questions. I'm available by email or messaging almost instantaneously, and I'm happy to help outside of these hours as well. And then I also have some sessions I do for Casper, ABS, MCAS, and CARS. So just thought I'd leave that out there. And then Q&A. So does anyone have any questions? We still have 10 minutes. I'm happy to stay a bit later as well. Any questions? Well, while you think of some, I'll go through a couple that I get pretty often. One is, do you restate the question? So when you look online, there is a lot of advice on you restating the question at the beginning of your answer and your introduction. And you can do that if you like, that's fine. I'm not totally sold on that idea. I think it wastes time, in your 8 minutes. It's not a strong start, and the reasoning behind it is that, oh, if you got the question wrong or interpreted it wrong, they might interrupt you and tell you. Sure, but another way to go about doing that in a more intelligent manner, I think, is to, instead of restating the question, say why they're asking you this question, right? Say like, oh, I think this is a phenomenal question because, and then state that ethical reason or whatever it is about why they're asking you this question, because that's really what's important. And if you get that wrong, they might still interrupt you and tell you, oh, no, that's not why we're asking you or whatnot, right? But this way, you're not wasting time restating it. It helps them understand that you know exactly what's going on. And if you start thinking in those 2 minutes in terms of, why are they asking me this? What do I have to answer? It'll make sure that you're never off target, that you always get to the main answer of what they're looking for. And so I'm not really for restating the question, but I do believe in changing the way you answer the question so that you're stating what's important here or why they're asking you. So that's one question. Out of curiosity, how would you approach your first scenario with 19-year-old alcoholic and elderly man liver transplant? Yeah, fantastic question. So I think one of the ways I do it is in terms of different topics that I want to talk about here, right? So I think talking about the legal aspect is something that's good. What are the guidelines for transplant, right? If you have an alcoholic, are you even allowed to give a transplant to an alcoholic? How long do they have to be sober for? I think it's 6 months, but don't quote me on that. And different considerations like that, right? You have to prove that you're going to be able to take care of this organ. This isn't just some willy-nilly thing that's been given to you, right? This has grave consequences. So that's one. You have to prove that you'll be able to take immunosuppressants your entire life and not destroy it again. And so these are all important considerations to have. The second is health, right? Who is more likely to survive the surgery? Is it the 19-year-old or is it the 80-year-old, the elderly man? And you can go into some of those health aspects. The third, I think, it's something that people should talk about here, is their own personal emotions, right? It's very easy, like, and it's okay to say that, at first glance, of course, you want to give it to the elderly man that's done so good, and maybe not the alcoholic, but that's just an emotional response, right? That's not a logical response, and so you want to take a step back and say, outside of these emotions, let me really evaluate this critically. And then so we talk about health, legal, social. There's a utilitarian perspective to be put into application here as well, and solely judge based on utility. There is also, you can consult the ethics committee. That's a valid answer as well, and say, this is a difficult decision. What are my companies or my hospital organizations, HR strategies that we have in place to deal with situations like this? So all of that, and then you culminate into if this, then this, or after answering all of this, I would come to this decision, whatever it is. It's okay to not just have one answer, because the way they're gonna phrase you these questions is they're not gonna give you all the information, and so your answers might change depending on the different information you receive, and that's totally okay. So I hope that helped. Uh, there's another question for Mac in particular. How long should our answers be, since we have 8 minutes to answer, but they're usually follow-ups? Also not sure if they're follow-ups for all or just some questions. Yeah, fantastic question again. So the target is 6 minutes, and then you get 2 follow-up questions, a minute each. That's the target. Now, if you get 5 minutes and you get more questions, that's fine. If you get 7 minutes and they're like, you know what, we don't have time for any follow-up questions, that's also okay. Right? Don't stress out about the length of your answer too much, as long as it's anywhere between 5 to 7. Less than 5 and you're like, you're probably not looking at it in depth enough, and longer than 7 and you might risk getting cut off, or maybe you're missing the point of the question. So I would say in an ideal world, 6 and then 2 follow-up questions is ideal. And they do have follow-up questions for every scenario, but they might ask, they might not, depending on, maybe you've already answered their follow-up question, and so some people just won't ask. Maybe you don't have enough time, and some people won't ask. And some people, no matter what, will always ask. So depending on your interviewers and if it's synchronous or asynchronous. But that's a very long-winded way of saying 6 plus 2 is kind of your ideal for math. Okay, what do we do when we're not sure about the legal course of an action? Yeah, so that's a great question, and in places like that, just say you don't know, right? Be honest, don't try to make stuff up, right? Don't be like, oh, I think it's 16 here. If you're not sure, then you're not sure, and that's okay, right? Hopefully you don't run into that situation because you're prepared and you've gone through that CPSO website, then, and you know it. But if you really don't, just say, I don't know. If it is this, then I would do this. And if my scenario is this, I would do this, right? You going back to some of that Casper if then there works just as well. And it's okay to admit it. And maybe other people will know. But there's strength and power in not just coming up with random answers, and being able to still answer it intelligently. So that's okay as well. Oh. Let me know if you have any other questions. Something else I usually get a lot is like, where do I look? So the advice there is, when you're speaking, you look into your camera, because that's like you're making direct eye contact with the person. And then when they're talking or when you're listening, you look down at your screen at their eyes or at their lips. And so that's usually how when we are talking to people, we usually look at their eye or their lips. And so that it just comes across more natural that way. But these are all good questions to ask in this virtual era of interviews. Okay, any other questions? I'm happy to answer. And you don't have to send them on the chat only. We can have a discussion as well. Yeah, what kind of attire should you wear? Professional, business professional, right? So for men, or I don't even want to generalize like that. Like just suits, a suit, tie, dress shirt, tie, blazer, dress pants is always a good idea. If you want to do, a pencil skirt and a blouse, or a blazer and a blouse and some trousers, things like that. And neutral colors, black, navy blue, are usually the most common. And then, if you feel comfortable and confident, and then your outfit is a way you express yourself, then you're more than happy to try you're more than welcome to try other colors and other examples. But that's usually the classic. You'll find about 95% of people do that. I wish I could pull off a maroon suit and an MMI. That would be fantastic. But unfortunately, I don't look good in maroon. Yeah, how long do you typically get from when you know you have an invite to when we have the interview? Yeah, great question. So McMaster gives you a ton of time, right? I think Mac released their interview invites last week, and their first round of interviews is March 4th, March 5th, and March 8th. They get a month and a half. Toronto usually gives you just a 2 week heads up. Ottawa, I don't know if it got released this week, or if not, it'll definitely come out next week. And their interviews are usually sometime late February, early March, so maybe a couple weeks. Queens has 2 rounds of interviews now. They'd first do an MMI asynchronously, and then they do a synchronous panel interview. And that's usually, late February, early March, and then their second round is late March. So that gives you 2-3 weeks as well. So on average, anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks is a pretty good a benchmark for how long you get to prep for interviews. Um, and I didn't reply out of province for med, unfortunately, so I'm not exactly sure, but I feel like that timeline is pretty reasonable out of province as well. Yeah, good question. Do you prep differently for each school, or is the prep generally similar? The prep is generally similar, right? So all of the points I went through today, all of this is how you go from getting your answer to a 5, satisfactory, to a 7 or an 8, which is your above expectation. And then that specific school prep about, oh, UFC is heavy on research, and maybe if I have a lot of research, I want to talk about it, or playing to the strengths and weaknesses of those schools. That comes in a bit later, but that's just gonna raise your answer by like maybe 7 to 7.5 or an 8 to an 8.5. That's not the predicting factor of whether you get into med school or not. Right. So keep your prep general, know all of these concepts we went through, practice overall, and that'll really help nail down your answers, I think. Any other questions? Does everyone here have an interview yet, or are you guys hoping for interviews? And is everyone here applying to medicine? Because if not, I can feel free to ask me some questions about other places as well. I'll try my best to answer them. Okay. Yeah, so someone said applying to medicine, haven't gotten any invites yet. That's okay. I wish you all the best. You have a pretty eventful week and a half, week to 2 weeks coming up. So good luck, and hopefully you get some interviews. Someone else said Mac Med. Any specific advice you have for Mac would be appreciated. Yeah, so no specific advice for Mac. I think what we talked about today should encompass it all. But Mac is very, very policy heavy, right, in terms of their questions. Overall, even if you look at it, Mac is a very, politically forward school, and so they love asking questions regarding different ethical scenarios, regarding different policy scenarios. Mac's also very research intensive. So if you're applying to the MD PhD, they will ask you questions about your research and your interest and things like that. So this talk fully pertains to Mac, and make sure you know your policy questions. And then of course you have your personal questions as well. Okay, someone else said hoping for an interview. Wish you all the best as well. Uh, okay, interview for MacMed. Congratulations. Uh, invite for McMaster. Very stressed for March 4th. Good luck. I don't think I'm going to be at the March 4th interview, but I probably will be at some of the later ones. I'm just at a conference that day. What month did you start prepping for interviews? So I started prepping as soon as I got my interview. So I got my Mac interview, and then a week or 2 weeks later, I got Queens. But yeah, I started right about now. I think this is a perfect time to start, and it gives you a great amount of time to practice. One more question. Do you have any advice on how, do you have any advice for how to approach an acting question? Oh, yes. Yeah. It's something we forgot to talk about. Yeah, good question. Honestly, the acting, just dive right into it, right? The more you are into it, the better it'll be. It's okay. It'll seem a bit awkward, but really commit. Like think like you're pick your favorite actor, Leonardo DiCaprio, whoever it is, right? So Margot Robbie, Emma Watson, whoever, and just pretend like you're them and get right into it because that'll make your answer really good. And a lot of these are just, they just want to see how empathetic you are, if you can handle the other person might be crying, and do you have the sense to be like, oh, let me get you some tissues, or just if they say something really serious and like, last night I was really close to killing myself. Well, you don't have to immediately jump in and say, oh, I'm so sorry, here, let's do this, let's do that, give solutions. No, just have a pause, let that sink in. Those are heavy words, right? So it's a lot of the acting is just a way for them to see your interpersonal skills, and how proficient you are there. So you can practice these scenarios again with family, friends, if you have a good group of people. But I know Mac usually has one acting interview, and so you're likely to get it. And it's mostly about just seeing your interpersonal skills, how empathetic and compassionate you are. Yeah, no worries. How did you find prepare people to prepare with? Did I know them prior? Was it through a Reddit or something like that? Yeah, so I did know them prior. I went to med sci at Western. I've been wanting to do medicine for a really long time. So I knew a lot of people applying. But I didn't pick, I actually didn't end up picking some of my closest friends to prep with. The group that I ended up prepping with the most was really like we were all peripheral. We were all associates and acquaintances, and like I would describe us as friends, but we didn't hang out all the time, and we weren't the best of buds. And I think that actually really helped, because it kept us on track and not be as distracted as much, and to say, we just won't study today, because then you have a personal responsibility to be there for this person that's giving up their time as well. And so it all ended up working really well for us, I think. But Reddit is a great place to find people. There's Slack groups, I think, and there's WhatsApp groups, Pre-Med 101. And if you know people applying, I'm all for open and honest communication. I've never been that person to like not tell people I'm applying or have an interview or stuff like that. Worst case, people have expectations for me and I don't get it. And so what, right? I think there's more utility or more to get out of telling people the truth, and maybe still you'll make a random connection and they'll help you out somehow, or they'll help you prep, or they'll give you some good advice, or they'll introduce you to someone. Like those random connections to me are worth a lot more than us and being embarrassed by people having expectations for me and not getting in. But that's just my personal outlook on life. I'm not trying to tell you that's the right thing to do, but that's kind of how I think about it. What specialization did I do at Western and Fisk Farm? Oh, great. So Fisk Farm means you have a fantastic GPA. I did a biochem of infection and immunity, and I actually did my thesis in Amanda Maring's lab. But she doesn't teach. She's been away from teaching for a few years, but she's a biology genetics professor, and so I work with her. And Christopher Brandel, who also just quit teaching, was my biochem prof. He was ridiculously hard when I was there. But yeah, it was my biochem was my lowest grade in undergrad, and I said, you know what, I'm not going to stand for this. I'm gonna major in it. I'll show them. And so then I went into that specialization. Okay, another question. What kind of questions did you ask when they gave you time to ask them med school questions? Yeah. So McMaster really doesn't ask you that. And mine was asynchronous for that. But I did my panel interview at Queens. And questions about what do you like about the program, right? What do you not like about it? Can you tell me something that's unique about the curriculum? You can ask about being worried, that you're worried about not being able to keep up with the amount of studying and what resources they offer. What do you like about the city that you live in, right? How hard is medical school and having a social life? Or can I What do you think about me being in a long distance relationship and managing medical school? Stuff like that. Just ask, good, genuine questions. You don't have to ask like some. Please don't ask like some medical concept like, oh, what's the value of D-dimer in a pulmonary embolism? Like don't be that person, but ask genuine questions that are important and interesting to you. And if you really want to know about D-dimers and Ps, you go ahead, but it might come across as a bit weird. Um, yeah, those are usually the type of questions I would recommend. Is the panel med students usual? Yeah, good question. Panel is usually one physician, one medical student, and one member of the community. That's usually how they do the panels. Queens does that. Western does that. Queens does medical student and physician, but you can also have physician and member of community. It just depends on who you get. But those are usually panels. Okay, fantastic. Any other questions? I have another meeting, unfortunately, in 5 minutes, but I can answer one or two more questions if we have any. If not, thank you all so much for coming. I'll be doing this again next Friday. If you have any questions, please reach out to me on Accept It Together. You can find my profile there. My name is Pranjan Gandhi. I will send it in the chat so you can find me. There you go. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.